I worked as a delivery driver for a local courier company for a little over 3 years. Most days were spent driving around places I probably would have never had a reason to visit otherwise, dropping off packages, getting signatures, and trying to finish my route before I had to start worrying about overtime. I was 29, renting an apartment in Pittsburgh with a roommate from work named Ryan. We'd known each other long enough that living together made sense. He worked the morning shift at the same company, while I usually took the later routes because I preferred starting my day around 10 or 11. I'd load the van at the warehouse, check the route on the handheld scanner, and spend few hours going from one address to another. When we were short on drivers, I'd get stuck with rural deliveries. They took longer because the addresses were spread out, but there was less traffic, fewer apartment buildings, and usually nobody waiting around for you to make a mistake. You'd pull into a driveway, leave the package, take a picture, and get back on the road. The only part I hated was when the GPS decided it knew better than I did. Our routing software worked pretty well in populated areas, but once you got out into the hills, it could send you onto roads that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 70s. There were plenty of roads around Pennsylvania that weren't much wider than a driveway, and some of them had names that seemed to change depending on which side of an intersection you were standing on. I'd gotten lost before. Usually I'd just turn around and find my way back to a main road. That night, I was already tired. I'd been given a rural overflow route because another driver had called out. I remember complaining about it to my supervisor because I'd already worked 6 days that week. He told me it shouldn't take more than a couple of extra hours. That turned out to be pretty optimistic. I finished most of the route without any problems, but I still had 6 deliveries left when it started getting dark. Most of them were in the same general area, although several miles apart. I called Ryan around 6:30 because he'd already gotten home. He answered while he was cooking something. "You still out?" "Unfortunately." "How many?" "6. He laughed. "You're not getting home tonight." "Thanks for the encouragement." He told me he'd leave some food for me and hung up. I'm only mentioning it because I remember some parts of that night unusually well. The last few deliveries were in an area around Washington County, where the roads became more wooded and the houses were farther apart. I had a couple of addresses near small towns, then one delivery that was way out on a rural road. The GPS showed the next stop as being about 12 minutes away. I followed it. The road narrowed pretty quickly. There were no street lights, and most of the houses were set back from the road behind trees. I remember seeing deer along the shoulder twice. I also slowed down a couple of times because leaves had collected across parts of the pavement, making it difficult to tell where the road ended and the shoulder began. Eventually, the GPS told me to make a right. I did. About 5 minutes later, I realized I hadn't seen another car since making the turn. That wasn't unusual enough to worry me. The problem was that the road on my GPS didn't seem to match the one I was actually driving on. The map showed me getting close to an intersection, but there was nothing ahead except trees. I slowed down and looked at the screen. The little blue arrow was still moving, so I figured the road must have been slightly different from what the map showed. I kept going. The delivery address was supposed to be a house at the end of a long driveway. When I reached the point where the driveway should have been, there was nothing there. I stopped the van and checked the address again. I was pretty sure I hadn't missed it. The GPS told me to continue another quarter mile and turn around. I turned around, drove back toward the previous intersection, and tried another road. The farther I went, the more obvious it became that I was probably nowhere near the address anymore. The road got narrower. In some places, the trees came almost right up to the shoulder, and eventually the houses disappeared completely. I pulled over and called the customer. It rang few times before going to voicemail. I left a message asking them to call me back. Then I called dispatch. Nobody answered. It was after 7 by then, so I figured the office had started shutting down for the evening. I looked at the road again and decided I'd just get back to the main road and figure everything out from there. I'd deal with the missed delivery tomorrow. I was about to start the van again when I saw someone standing beside the road. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. She was wearing pajamas. It wasn't summer. It was cold enough that I could see my breath when I got out of the van, and she was standing beside a completely empty stretch of road wearing what looked like thin pajama pants and a long-sleeved shirt. She didn't have a coat. She didn't have shoes either, at least not that I could see. She was on the opposite side of the road, facing my van. I thought there was a house hidden somewhere behind the trees. I rolled the window down. "Hey," she didn't answer. I looked around, expecting to see an adult somewhere nearby. There was nobody. "Are you okay?" She walked a little closer. I got out of the van. At the time, I thought some kid had gotten outside without her parents noticing. She looked cold. I asked her where her parents were. She said they were home. "Where's home?" She pointed farther down the road. I looked in the direction she was pointing, but I couldn't see a house. There were just trees and the road disappearing into the darkness. She looked back at me. "Can you take me there?" I didn't know exactly what the company policy was for something like that, but I knew I wasn't supposed to put a child into a delivery vehicle without knowing who they belonged to. "Where are your parents?" "They're waiting." There was something strange about the way she said it. She didn't sound scared. She wasn't crying. She didn't sound excited or upset. She just said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I asked her name. She told me. I don't want to write it down. I asked if she lived nearby. She nodded. Then she pointed down the road again. "Just follow me." I told her I couldn't leave my van there. I don't know why I listened to her. I've thought about that, more than I can count. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't taking anything. I'd been tired, but I'd driven plenty of long shifts before without a problem. The girl started walking down the road. I got back into the van and followed her slowly. She stayed along the shoulder, walking at a normal pace. I was thinking there had to be a house somewhere ahead. Nothing appeared. The GPS had stopped updating. I glanced at it and saw the same section of road I'd already driven through. I tapped the screen. Nothing happened. The girl kept walking. I don't remember how long I followed her. That's where my memory gets strange. I remember the girl walking ahead of my van, but I don't remember seeing the house. There are just pieces missing. The next thing I remember is someone shaking my shoulder. I opened my eyes and saw a man standing over me. For a few seconds I had no idea where I was. I was lying beside a road. The man. He was wearing a heavy jacket and holding a flashlight. Hey, you all right?" I tried to sit up. My head hurt. He grabbed my arm and helped me upright. "Where am I?" He looked at me like he wasn't sure what I meant. "You know where you are?" I looked around. There was a road behind me, but it was wider than the one I'd been driving on. My delivery van wasn't right beside me. The man told me he'd been driving home when he saw me lying near the shoulder. He said I'd been there when he came around the bend. I asked him where my van was. He pointed farther down the road. It was probably 100 yards away, partly on the shoulder. I stood up and immediately felt dizzy. The man told me to sit back down. I asked what road we were on. He gave me the name. I didn't recognize it. I asked him again because I thought I'd heard him wrong. He repeated it. It was another rural road in the same general part of the county, but it wasn't the road I'd been driving on. According to my own memory, I had never turned onto it. The man called an ambulance because he thought I might have hit my head. I told him I didn't need one. He looked at me and said I was lying on the side of a road in freezing weather and had apparently lost consciousness, so I didn't really get a vote. While we waited, I kept trying to remember what had happened. I asked him if he'd seen anybody else. He said no. I asked if he'd seen a little girl. He looked at me for a second. "What little girl?" I described her. He shook his head. "No." I asked if there were houses nearby. He said there were a few, but not close enough that he'd expect a kid to be walking around out there alone. I could still picture her standing beside the road. I remembered her voice. They checked me over and asked if I'd been drinking. Asked if I'd taken anything. I hadn't. They asked if I knew where I was. I did. They asked what day it was. I answered correctly. They recommended that I go to the hospital, but I refused. Looking back, that wasn't the smartest decision I've ever made. I called my supervisor. He was furious at first, until he heard what had happened. Then he was mostly confused. The company had already received an alert from the van because it had been stopped for too long. He asked me where I'd been. I gave him the road name. Then he said, "That's not where your last stop is." I know. I mean, you're not even close to the address. I got lost. He asked how I'd ended up there. I couldn't explain it. Eventually, a coworker came out to pick up the van, and I rode back with him. I remember barely speaking during the drive. I checked the delivery scanner. There was no record of me completing the delivery. There also wasn't any useful location history showing exactly where I'd been during the period I couldn't remember. The GPS had a gap. My supervisor said that sometimes happened in rural areas. The problem was the girl. I couldn't explain her. I never found out whether anybody had actually reported a girl missing that night. I never found her house. The company moved me back to regular routes after that. I didn't ask them to. They just stopped giving me rural deliveries, at least for a while. I quit about 8 months later. The thing I've never been able to get past is that I know what I remember. I remember the girl standing beside the road. I remember her asking me to take her home. I remember following her. Then there's a gap. After that, I'm lying beside a completely different road with a stranger standing over me. Maybe I was more exhausted than I realized and lost consciousness somewhere along the way. Most of all, I remember her pointing down that road and telling me that her parents were waiting. Whatever happened after that, I don't remember. That's what I have to live with. I was 31 when this happened, and my mom was in the hospital for surgery that I thought was going to be pretty routine. She'd been having problems for a while, and after a few appointments and tests, her doctor decided surgery was the best option. It wasn't supposed to be some emergency or anything life-threatening. The plan was for her to have the procedure, stay overnight, and hopefully go home the next day. My sister Riley and I took turns staying with her that night. Our dad wasn't around, so it was mostly just the two of us. Riley was closer to my mom than I was, partly because she lived nearby. She was about 40 minutes from the hospital, while I was closer to an hour away depending on traffic. I'd driven down after work with a backpack containing some clothes and my laptop. I figured if I was going to be sitting in a hospital room all night, I might as well get some work done. The hospital never really became quiet. Even after midnight, there were nurses walking through the halls, machines beeping behind doors, elevators opening and closing, and people talking quietly at the nurses' station. Mom slept through most of it. Riley was sitting in the chair beside her bed, scrolling through her phone. I was on the little couch against the wall, watching something on my laptop with the volume turned almost all the way down. Around 1:30 in the morning, Riley looked over at me. "You should probably go home." I told her I wasn't going anywhere. She laughed. "You're falling asleep sitting up." She wasn't wrong. I'd been awake since around 6 that morning, and that couch wasn't exactly helping. We talked quietly for a while, nothing important. She complained about the hospital coffee. I complained about the couch. We talked about work and what we were going to do the next day if Mom ended up staying longer than expected. Eventually, Riley mentioned that she'd forgotten her phone charger at home. That led to her remembering a bunch of other things she'd left behind. She wanted a pair of sweatpants, some toiletries, a jacket, stuff. Her house was in a semi-rural area outside town. She looked at me. "Could you grab my stuff?" I asked why she couldn't go herself. She pointed toward Mom. "I don't want to leave her alone." That was fair. "I'll go." She gave me a list, and I put it in my phone. Before leaving, I checked on Mom. She was still asleep. I told Riley I'd be back in about an hour. It was around 2:45 when I walked out of the hospital. I'd been inside for hours, so I hadn't really noticed how much the temperature had dropped outside. I got into my truck and let the heater run for a minute before pulling out. I wasn't scared. I wasn't thinking about strange stuff. Mostly, I was annoyed that I had to leave a warm hospital in the middle of the night and drive 40 minutes for a pair of sweatpants and a phone charger. Riley had left the porch light on, so I knew I'd be able to see the front of the house when I got there. There wasn't much traffic. I passed a couple of trucks on the main road, and once I got farther out, I barely saw another vehicle. Her area wasn't really a neighborhood in the usual sense. There were houses along a few roads, but some properties had few acres between them. She'd bought the house because she wanted somewhere quieter than where she'd been living before. I'd made fun of her for it when she moved in. I told her she'd get tired of driving everywhere. She said that was the whole point. When I pulled into her driveway, the porch light was glowing through the trees. I went inside and grabbed everything she'd asked for. I was thirsty, so I took a bottle of water from the refrigerator. The whole thing took like 5 minutes. I stood in the kitchen, drinking half the bottle, and looked at the clock. It was around 3-something. For a second, I thought about sitting down for a few minutes, but I didn't want to leave Riley alone at the hospital any longer than I had to. I locked the house behind me and got back into the truck. The first part of the drive was the same road I'd taken there. Eventually, I turned onto a smaller road that go through a heavily wooded area. Trees came close to the shoulder on both sides. My thoughts kept going back to my mom. I was trying to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. The doctors had explained everything. The surgery was supposed to go well, and Riley was sitting right beside her. But when someone you love is in a hospital, knowing they're probably going to be fine doesn't completely shut your brain off. I was also more tired than I'd realized. I came around a bend, and something dark appeared in the middle of my headlights. It looked like a large black object sitting in the lane. My first thought was that somebody had dropped a garbage bag or something from a truck. I hit the brakes, sat there with my foot on the brake, staring through the windshield. The thing was completely black against the pavement. I wondered if it was an animal. It wasn't moving. I put the truck in park and looked around. There wasn't another car anywhere. I glanced at the clock. I probably should have just gone around whatever it was. Instead, I opened the door and got out. I don't have a good explanation for that. I was tired and wasn't thinking clearly. I thought it was something that could cause an accident if another driver came along. Whatever the reason, I took my phone out and turned on the flashlight. The air felt even colder outside. I walked toward the middle of the road. About halfway there, I realized I wasn't actually walking toward anything. The dark shape I'd been looking at wasn't there. I stopped. I pointed my phone at the pavement. Nothing. There was no garbage bag, no animal. The road was empty. I walked a few more steps just to make sure I wasn't somehow looking in the wrong place. There was nothing. I turned around and looked back at my truck. Its headlights were still shining down the road. Then I checked both sides. The woods were just black between the trees. I'd mistaken a shadow for something. The headlights were hitting the road at an angle, and there were branches and trees all around me. Maybe something had moved in the wind and created a shape that looked solid for a second. That was what I decided had happened. I went back to the truck. I got inside, shut the door, and started the engine. The heater came back on, and I sat there for a moment while the air warmed up. I put the truck in drive. Before I could pull away, I heard something close to me, like a person's voice, almost right beside my left ear. I couldn't make out the words. It was more like a short piece of a sentence, followed by a breath. I turned toward the driver's side window. Nothing. I looked across the cab toward the passenger side. Nothing there. I wondered if it had come through the radio, and I looked toward the driver's side again. A figure was standing between the trees. It was so close to the truck that the distance couldn't have been more than a few feet. I tried to make sense of the shape. Something wrong. It looked roughly like a person. The shoulders, the torso, and the legs. But there was nothing above the shoulders. No head. The upper part of the shape just disappeared into the darkness. I stared at it, waiting for my eyes to adjust. The figure remained in the same spot. Its legs were spread unusually far apart, not just a person standing comfortably with their feet apart. The whole thing was black. I couldn't make out clothes or skin. There wasn't enough light to see any details. It almost looked like the shape of a person had been cut out of the darkness itself. My chest tightened. I tried to take a deep breath, but it felt like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. Both of my hands went onto the steering wheel. The figure didn't move. I have no idea how long I sat there looking at it. I leaned slightly toward the window. The shape was still standing there. I could see the shoulders. I could see the legs. I could see how far apart they were. The woods were only a few feet from the side of the road. There wasn't much distance between the truck and where the figure was standing. I put the truck into reverse. The figure stayed where it was. I backed up faster than I should have, almost went onto the shoulder. I corrected the steering, shifted into drive, and pulled away. I was going much faster than I normally would have on that road. The curves came up quickly, and I was gripping the steering wheel hard. I barely slowed down until I reached the main road. Once I was there, I could see houses and businesses in the distance, and there were a few other cars on the road. My breathing finally started to settle down. I looked at the clock, around 3:40. It felt like I'd been sitting there much longer. I drove straight back to the hospital. When I walked into my mom's room, Riley looked up from her chair. "What happened?" I told her I'd almost hit something on the road. I didn't mention the figure. I handed her the bag, and she started going through everything she'd asked me to get. My mom was still asleep. Riley pulled out the charger and looked at me. "You okay?" "I'm just tired." She didn't believe me, but she didn't keep asking. A little later, I told her I'd seen something weird on the road. I said I thought it might have been an animal, but when I got out to check, there was nothing there. I left out the rest. I definitely wasn't going to tell her I'd seen something that looked like a headless person standing a few feet from my truck. She would have assumed I'd fallen asleep while driving. Honestly, part of me wondered if that's exactly what had happened. The next morning, Mom was awake, and the doctor said everything had gone well. The voice. I couldn't figure out where it had come from. The windows were closed, and the figure. I looked up stories about people seeing things on dark roads when they're exhausted. There were stories involving headlights, shadows, peripheral vision, sleep deprivation, and highway hypnosis. I didn't tell my mom. She had enough to deal with. Riley eventually found out what I'd actually seen. A few weeks later, I was at her house, and we were sitting in the kitchen. She brought up that night again and asked what I'd seen on the road. I told her the whole thing. She stared at me. "Are you serious?" "I've driven through that area plenty of times during the day. I've even gone past that exact stretch of road. There's a shallow ditch beside the pavement, trees behind it, and a couple of driveways farther down. It looks like any other rural road. I don't know what I saw that night." I'm Hannah. I lived alone in a rental house for about 3 years before this happened. It was more space than I really needed. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 bathroom upstairs, a small bedroom downstairs, and a living room and kitchen connected in the back. I left around 7:30 every morning and got home somewhere between 5 and 5:30. I wasn't the kind of person who spent much time away from home after work. The pipes made noise when somebody in the neighborhood was using water. The air conditioner would kick on and make the hallway door move a little. The stairs creaked in a couple places. None of that bothered me. I left the office after 5 and drove home. I pulled into my driveway, got out, grabbed the grocery bag from the passenger seat, and walked up to the front door. I put my key in the lock and then noticed the door wasn't locked. I tried the handle again because I thought I hadn't noticed it was already unlocked when I left that morning. It opened. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to lock it. I did that occasionally when I was running late. I wasn't happy about it, but I didn't think somebody had been inside. I went in and set my groceries on the kitchen counter. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing was missing from the kitchen or living room. I went upstairs and checked my bedroom. Then I went into the bathroom. The towel hanging beside the shower was damp. I could tell somebody had used it. I had taken a shower that morning and hung the towel up before leaving. By the time I got home, it should have been completely dry. I touched it again just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. It was definitely damp. Then I went downstairs and noticed the toilet. I had a small half bathroom downstairs. The toilet seat was up and there was urine in the bowl. It hadn't been flushed. I knew I hadn't used that bathroom that morning. I always used the upstairs bathroom before work. Someone had been in my house. I went back outside and called the police. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't going to walk around the house looking for somebody by myself. I explained what I'd found. I told them the front door had been unlocked, The towel upstairs was damp, and somebody had used the downstairs bathroom. They went through the house. Nobody was there. Nothing had been stolen. Nobody had been hurt. I asked if they thought someone had actually been inside. The officer looked at me and said, "Based on what you've told me, it sounds like somebody was in the house." After that, I checked every window. Everything was empty. I called my sister and told her what happened. She was convinced I'd somehow left the door unlocked and forgotten about the towel. "Maybe you used it this morning and just don't remember," she said. "I would remember somebody using the downstairs bathroom." "Okay, yeah, that's weird." She told me to call her when I got into bed. I did. Nothing else happened. The next morning I went to work like normal. I considered staying home, but I didn't really have a reason to call out. The police had searched the house and I had locked everything. I spent most of the day thinking about it anyway. There was something particularly uncomfortable about knowing that somebody could have been inside my house while I was gone. I kept thinking about the towel. Whoever had been there had used my bathroom. I got home that afternoon and everything looked same. I checked the locks before going inside. Nothing had been touched. That night I was sitting on the couch around 11. I was scrolling through my phone when I heard something upstairs, someone walking across the floor. I heard another sound from upstairs. I sat there thinking about what it could be. I'd never heard the house make that particular noise before. I wondered if something had fallen. I eventually stood up. I remember not wanting to go upstairs, but I also didn't want to sit downstairs wondering if someone was actually up there. I grabbed my phone and called my sister. "What?" "I think somebody might be in my house." I heard footsteps upstairs. While we were still on the phone, I stayed downstairs and listened. Nothing else happened. The police arrived again. I told them exactly what I'd heard. They checked the house again, including upstairs. They opened closets and looked behind the shower curtain and checked the rooms. Nobody was there. They checked outside. One of the officers asked if I had an attic. I did, but it was one of those small access panels in the hallway ceiling. He checked it too. I was feeling weird standing there in my pajamas while two police officers walked around my house looking for somebody who apparently didn't exist. They said, if I thought someone had a key or was getting inside, I should consider changing the locks. I told him I would. That was the end of it. I sat at my desk processing claims while my coworkers talked about things. I didn't tell anybody what had happened. I was still thinking that way when I drove home the next afternoon. I parked in the driveway and walked toward the front door. I unlocked the door and walked inside, put my purse down, then I went upstairs. My bedroom door was open. I usually kept it open, so that didn't mean anything. I walked inside, and there was a pig's head sitting on my bed. It was an actual pig's head. It had been cleaned, but it still looked like a butchered animal's head. Whoever had put it there had positioned it on the middle of my bed, facing toward the bedroom door. It wasn't just thrown there. It had been placed there deliberately. I just screamed. I backed out of the room, ran downstairs, grabbed my purse, and went straight out the front door. I didn't stop to lock anything. I ran across the street to my neighbors. They were an older couple who lived there with their adult son. I started banging on their door. The woman opened it and asked what was wrong. "There's somebody in my house." Her husband came over. I was trying to explain, but I couldn't. "There's a pig's head on my bed." I finally said it. The husband looked at me like he wasn't sure he'd heard me correctly. "What?" "There's a pig's head on my bed." He told me to come inside. I called the police again. I stood by their front window looking at my house. I couldn't see anybody outside. I kept thinking about the fact that whoever had done it had to have been inside the house long enough to get upstairs, put the head on my bed, and leave. And I had no idea when it happened. The police arrived with few officers this time. I told them I hadn't gone back inside. I pointed toward the upstairs bedroom from across the street. They checked the entire house again. Nobody was there. The pig's head was on my bed. I didn't have anybody in my life who I could imagine doing this. I wasn't in a fight with anyone. I wasn't dealing with a stalker. I hadn't threatened anybody. I hadn't broken up with someone recently. There wasn't some person I had secretly been worried about. Nothing. The officers treated it seriously. but there wasn't much evidence for them to work with. They photographed the room and the head. They looked for signs that someone had forced a door or window. There weren't any. The front door hadn't been broken, the windows weren't broken. Nothing else in the house had been damaged. My sister came over later and stayed with me. There was a point where she asked me, "What do you think they want?" I didn't have an answer. That was the question everybody kept asking. What was the point? If somebody wanted money, they could have taken my television, my laptop, jewelry, or anything else. If they wanted to hurt me, they had opportunities. The first time, they'd apparently been inside the house. They didn't take anything. They used my bathroom. The second time, they made noise upstairs and left. Then somebody brought a pig's head into the house and put it on my bed. It seemed like the entire purpose was to make me know someone had been there. The police seemed to think the same thing. Officers told me it looked like somebody was trying to scare me. I asked if the pig's head could have come from a butcher shop or meat market. The officer said it was possible. He said there was no way for him to know where it came from without more information. I spent the next couple of days at my sister's. My landlord came by and looked around the house. He was confused too. He said he'd never had anything like that happen with one of his properties. We talked about whether someone might have gotten a key somehow. The landlord said he didn't give my key to anyone else. I believed him. The police never found anyone in the house. They never found out who had been inside. There were no useful fingerprints, and there wasn't some obvious clue pointing toward a particular person. I kept thinking about the possibility that somebody had hunted the pig themselves, but I had no reason to believe that. It could just as easily have come from a meat market or somewhere that processed animals. I remember searching online for places that sold whole pig heads because I wanted to understand how somebody could even get one. I didn't stay in that house much longer. I had been planning to stay there for at least another year, but I couldn't make myself feel comfortable there anymore. I moved out later that same week. My sister and a couple of friends helped me pack. We loaded my clothes, kitchen stuff, electronics, and furniture into a couple of vehicles and moved everything into another place. I never found out who did it. I was left with 3 separate things that didn't make much sense. Someone had been inside my house and used the downstairs bathroom. Someone had apparently used my towel. Someone had been inside again that night, or at least I heard somebody walking upstairs. And then somebody brought a pig's head into my bedroom and placed it on my bed like it belonged there. I never had another incident after moving. Nobody followed me. Nobody came to the new place. I wondered if someone had simply picked my house at random and thought it would be funny to scare me. They knew the area. They had seen me leave for work every morning. Maybe they had been watching the house for some reason. I don't know. The police thought the person was trying to frighten me, and I agree with that. I just never understood why they chose me. I still don't. You know, seeing that pig's head sitting in the middle of my bed, there was no explanation for it. I just knew somebody had been inside my home while I was gone, and they had taken the time to leave it there for me to find. That was the scariest thing I've ever experienced.